Kelly here, and today I am back with a video featuring some Picket Fence products, but really it's all about the technique. So I'm using the dahlias, the sweet peas, I can't remember the name of this one. It'll all be linked below. This is the hydrangea, that's my daisy. But basically I chose Picket Fence because they have a lot of really large florals, and that was what I was after, was the large florals. So you can use whatever you have. I'm going to be doing some stamping. I'm using all watercolor paper, but I'm going to be doing some stamping in white heat embossing, and how I prefer to do mine is by treating with my anti-static tool, inking it up in a white pigment ink, stamping it not once, but twice to make sure I have good coverage, and then I use a white detail embossing powder, and all that means is it's just a little bit finer, so it's not going to have a coarse look. It will go very smooth for more intricate stamps, which Picket Fence does have a lot of. It's a lot of what I'm using today. For my watercolor cardstock, they are cut down just slightly smaller than an A2 size card. That means that I'll have to mat all of them, or I'll have to use my card base as the mat, but that's actually fine because the watercolor paper I use is Canson Monteval watercolor paper, and I buy the block in a 12 by 16, which then allows me to get 3 rows of 4 inches, cards that are 4 inches by 5 1/4. So it allows me to get 8 pieces out of 1 piece of watercolor paper, and I clearly am making a lot of cards. Now, I know that most of you are not going to be, well, some of you may be, because some people are definitely more quantity over, I don't want to say quantity over quality, because that's not true, because if you make a lot of cards, they can still all be very pretty. But I am a person who typically it takes me 2 hours to make 1 card. But since I was making these to donate, I needed to make a lot of Mother's Day cards in a short period of time, which is what led me to the different techniques I'm going to be using today, which is all about watercoloring with Distress Oxides. I typically prefer Distress inks because they are bolder. Oxides have pigment properties, and so they dry back like a chalkier finish, a much softer finish. And since I like a lot of bold contrast, that doesn't always really work for me. However, I do own them, and I believe in using the products that you own. So I am going to be using my oxides. I picked kind of a rainbow of colors. This is picked raspberry, carved pumpkin, mustard seed, mowed lawn, peacock feathers, salty ocean, and wilted violet. But by all means, use whatever colors you would like to use. First up is a very simple, straightforward watercoloring. This is a white heat embossed image. This is actually the sweet peas. We're going to zoom in here. And the easiest way to do any sort of watercoloring is with a heat embossed line. It doesn't have to be white, it could be any color you like. You could even use clear and just use the color of the paper. But the reason that it's easier is because those embossed lines kind of give you little segments or little caverns that will hold your pigment ink just in that, or hold your water just in that little area, which means that you can work next to 2 areas that are wet, where with traditional watercolor, where you have nothing separating them, no embossed line, kind of creating that dam for the water, you can't work next to 2 areas that are wet because they'll bleed together. Unless that's the look you're going for, which is totally a look, but that's not the look I was going for. So here, all I'm doing is I'm going in, I'm wetting my flower, and then I'm doing kind of a 2-color blend. So I'm putting pink down on the edges of the petals, and I am putting a little bit of that wilted violet kind of more towards the base. And for the leaves, I will be using mowed lawn and mustard seed to get kind of a darker green and then of a lighter kind of green yellow. But this gives us a really pretty blend of watercolor without having to do all of the work. So I'm going to do a couple flowers here. I can't even tell you it's real time because all of my videos are sped up ×2 just because coloring and painting takes a lot of time. You're going to see as we go, though, I'm going to speed it up quite a bit more, and there's going to be parts that I do cut out. Now, normally I wouldn't do that, but we are making 9 cards here, so There are pieces, parts that just couldn't make the cut. It just couldn't happen. This is already a super long video. So anyway, easiest way to do any sort of watercoloring, heat emboss it, and then put down your water, put down your pigment, and let the water do the work. Once you drop your pigment in, if the area is still wet and you want the pigment to be darker, you can go back in and add more ink. But if it is dry, then you need to re-wet the whole area to add darker pigment. Like, you'll need to do a new layer. But if it's still wet, you can add in its color as much times as you want, and you will see as we're going through, like, I go back to those first flowers and still add in darker purples or darker pinks. Again, this is something that I know about myself. I know I like a lot of contrast. So I typically don't use my oxides, but I know they're very popular because they do blend easier if you're ink blending on cardstock. Now, I don't necessarily know that they blend color to color better. I don't know if I think that that's true, but I do know that they blend onto the paper better. So if you were doing like a blue sky and you wanted to just ink blend all blue, that would be easier with oxides. It just is what it is. With Distress ink, you have to kind of build up the layers in order to make it smooth. But anyway, we're going to go through and we're going to do this. Very quickly, I realized in doing my watercoloring that a lot of the detail of the stamp was white heat embossed. So you weren't going to get the full effect unless I put in a background color, which is something else you can do. And once we get there, which will just be here in just a smidge of a bit, I will show you the easiest way for me to do that, like the easiest way that I have learned to achieve that kind of look. I did end up, for those of you who have been following along, I did successfully donate all 20 cards. I made 20 Mother's Day cards to donate to the mamas in the NICU. The lady who put Sydney was her name, the lady who put the bags and stuff together. She also has a baby in the NICU, and so she was putting together like little comfort bags for all of these mamas who were spending Mother's Day in the NICU, which I totally love. So here, now we're going to go in. All of the coloring is down in the image, and you can see these big blank areas that we have. So in order to put down a background that's going to be a nice wash and kind of blend out to white, the idea I was going for was a blue sky. Like, you were looking at these sweet peas up against a blue sky background. But again, you don't have to do that. You could use any color background that you wanted. So basically, you're going to go in, you want to have a little bit of a larger brush, or a brush that's going to hold a little bit more water. Now, I still needed to get into some smaller areas, so I didn't go too much larger, and my brush still has a point on it. This one is this is from Altenew. I wish I knew what size it was, because I can't seem to find it right now. But anyway, I think it's a 4 or an 8, but it has a nice pointed tip. And basically, you're going to work in sections. So I just went and put down water anywhere that I wanted my pigment to flow in that section. So for me, since I've kind of cut across my card diagonally, I just went along one side of the diagonal, laid down all of my water. You do want to make sure all of your edges stay wet. So you don't want it to be like bubbled up that it's running over your paper, but you do want the area to be wet so your pigment will move. Otherwise, you're just going to be dry painting, which is a totally different technique, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not going to get you this result if that's what you're going for. So I put down the blue closer to the florals so that you could see that white embossed area kind of pop forward. And you can see like all the little swirls and stuff that are embossed off the vines of the sweet peas. And that is what I wanted to show. And then just before I add any more pigment, I'm making sure that my edges stay wet. And you could use a bigger brush if you don't have to go into these smaller areas like I am doing here. But I'm just going to put down that water wherever I want it to flow. Now I am going to, flip over and do another section, this kind of section up at the top here. was still a little wet because I'm sure you probably saw me. I missed a part that was green and I had to go back in and put it in. The green into the blue does not bother me. I don't mind that. But if you do, then you're going to want to wait till everything is dry for your flowers. And then went in, wet this, little section. And then I also started to add some blue kind of down into the bottom left corner so that the white would look like clouds. So this whole area is wet and I'm just kind of pulling the color out as far as I want it to go and adding darker color where I want, where I want it to be more concentrated. And then that light area is going to act as my clouds. And then that one's done. We're going to set it aside to dry. With my same kind of color palette I've got going on here, we're going to move right into the next technique, which I'm using for I think it's called a Mophead Hydrangea is the title of the actual stamp set. And this one is much looser. Like this is probably one of my favorite techniques with with either watercolor, Distress Oxide or Distress ink. You're going to wet the whole paper because we don't care where the pigment goes. We want the pigment to go everywhere, okay? And once the whole area is wet, now I definitely should have gone in and gotten my flat brush to put down the water a lot faster, but I just had this one in my hand and I did what I did. But basically, this one works with, why can't I think of the word that I want? Analogous colors. So I have 3 colors here, pink, purple, and blue. They are all next to each other on the color wheel. So I'm going to be able to drop them in just anywhere and they'll work really nicely together and it won't be ugly. It's not going to make brown. It's, they're going to work really well together and you can just go in, drop it anywhere that you would like. I'm even dropping it over the leaves. Just drop it wherever you would want it to go. And you can keep working on this and adding in darker pigments if you want them to be a little bit bolder. When I'm doing this with Distress inks, there are sometimes that Picked Raspberry is a really good one. It's one of my favorite colors. I use a lot of it. And when you water it down, it gets really, really light. I so wish that Tim had released like a raspberry Distress ink, like a dark magenta. He didn't, so Picked Raspberry is what I am left with. But I will use my re-inkers instead of squishing my ink pad down. I will use re-inker so that I can get a stronger, bolder color. You could probably do that with oxides too, but I've never tried it. So this one is the Daisy, and I'm pretty much doing the same thing that we did with the first one, but since we're going to die cut it, I don't really have to be as specific about where I put the colors down at. I can just, put the water down, drop the pigment ink, drop the Distress Oxide in, and, let it do its own thing. I don't have to be, because it's a bigger flower than those tiny little sweet peas. And because I am going to be die cutting it out, I don't have to worry about the background showing. This one will end up being paired with some other die cuts. And even though it's my illustration, even though it's my flower, this actually is the card that I end up liking the least. But we all just have our own preferences. The big difference between this one and the other one is that instead of dropping in the pink at the edges and then dropping in the purple at the base, I'm going to do the whole thing pink first. I'm just going to, fill in my clean water, drop in my Picked Raspberry, and then I'm going to add any additional colors that I want. So it's going to be the mainstay of pink, and then I did drop in some mustard seed kind of more toward the base. This is a Gerber Daisy, so they come in all kinds of colors. You could even go so far as to, maybe put some purples on the tips, and then it would go from purple to pink to yellow. That would be really fun too. Full disclosure, I ended up changing this card before I donated it because I had the same daisy that I had colored when I first got the set. Here I'm doing a little bit of color mixing. So purple and yellow are complementary colors, which means when you mix them, they're going to give you a brown. And so I used that to shade the inside of my daisy just so I didn't have to pull out another color. So that's a little trick you can use. I also could have done it with the pink and green as well. That would have been, that would have worked also because they're complementary colors. But anyway, I had a Copic Color one that in the same, like it was pink with the yellow. And I ended up actually adhering that over the watercolor one because I liked it better. Okay, so now moving on to the next one. Here I am using the Chrysanthemum, but it's not stamped. So for this one, we're wetting the whole background, and then we're just going to dot in some colors. The reason that I brought in the stamp was so that I could generally see where I wanted my colors to be. And this one is a big one for just letting the water do the work, which is really, really challenging because it looks like trash. And you're going to see here when I'm doing it, it does not look good. It looks, it looks a little polka dotty, but as we're adding more pigment and, we're adding more water with our brush, they will start to move together. So I knew that the largest part of the chrysanthemum would be at the top. I'm going to use yellow as a buffer, and then I'm going to transfer some greens, some blues, and some teals to the bottom because I know that's where the leaf is. And then for this one, that's it. I'm just going to let it be what it is, and I'm going to set it aside to dry. This one is for the daffodils, which we're going to be doing a bleaching technique on. So for the background, all I'm really doing is just creating my scene. So I'm doing a little bit of a blue sky, a little bit of green grass, nothing too terribly exciting about this. Just kind of setting the stage for where I'm going to put my daffodils down. And like I said, once this is dry, that's where we're going to be doing more of the technique with this one in particular. So just do a nice soft wash and then set it aside to dry. This is now, I told you before, the other one might be my favorite technique. This is the second runner-up for sure. So this is just like rainbow watercolor. Like I try to put colors next to each other that will look really nice together. But it doesn't have to be. You just wet the whole background, drop in a bunch of color. I like to do rainbow, but you could do, whatever you like. And then I'm going to let it dry. I also like to do spatters, so that way I get a little bit of purple in my teal and a little bit of blue in my pink. But you can skip the spatters if you don't want that much color variation. So I'm just going to do that and then set this one aside to dry. And the last one is just straight ink smushing. So I've got all of these puddles of color, I'm done painting, and I'm going to wet my paper and then just dip them right into the ink that's left on my glass mat. You can, of course, add other colors. Here I missed a little bit of blue, so I put some Salty Ocean down and then sprayed it with a little bit of water and then dip my paper in it. And again, just going to set it aside to dry. So now these are dry. This is the hydrangea that we did before. For this one, I am going to be adding some Copic Coloring to the hydrangea. So the background will kind of fall into the background and the bolder color of the hydrangeas will pop forward. You don't have to do this with alcohol markers. You could absolutely do this with more watercolor if you wanted. You could do this with colored pencil. My preferred medium is alcohol markers, so that's what I'm using. But I'm just using 2 colors because I don't want to completely cover up that beautiful watercolor. I love the way it's making my colors blend, but I'm just using it to add some dimension. So I'm using some blues, purples, and then you'll see here in a minute I'm going to bring in some pinks. And this is, again, we're just adding shadows kind of where one lays on top of the other. We're adding shadows where 2 points meet. So in the center of the flower, we're definitely going to have some more shadows there. You can color your embossing if you put alcohol markers over them. It will color it. And so in this case, I didn't want that. Once we get more towards the end, I'll show you how I clean that up so that it's not a problem and doesn't tint my white embossing. I still get that nice white embossing. I'm not going to show you the entirety of this coloring because we are on borrowed time. So I'm just going to show you the little bits of each kind of color, and then we will move on to the cleanup and then on to the next card. So for the cleanup, your colorless blender is going to be your best friend. You just need a scrap piece of paper and your colorless blender. You'll go in, go right over top of that embossing, and then scribble off the ink that you pick up onto your scrap piece of paper. You do want to scribble it off every time, or you're just going to redeposit the color and just kind of smear it all around. So you just go through, clean up any areas that you want, and then this is our completed card. Next, we're going to move on to the stamping. Now, you may be asking yourself, Kelly, why didn't you stamp these first if you were going to stamp them anyway? The reason I didn't stamp them first is because Distress Oxide does have that pigment ink property, and so it dulls any blacks. It gets that chalky film over top of it, and I wanted my blacks to be bold. Because I want my blacks to be bold, I also stamp these 2 times, sometimes 3 if they need it, which is why I am using my Misty. The important thing to note is that the ink that I'm using, it's Intense Black ink from Picket Fence. It is safe for alcohol markers and watercolor. So that's just something to know dependent upon what you're going to be doing with your card. You want to make sure that you're using a black ink or whatever color you choose to stamp in that is going to work with the technique that you want. So here I'm stamping down the Chrysanthemum, and again, I'm stamping down each of these, multiple times. Here is that rainbow background where we just painted it on randomly. Love the way this one came out. For this one, I chose to use the dahlia. Now, the dahlia is not as big as some of these other flowers, so in order to kind of fill the card, I'm going to be doing a little bit of masking. I'm going to stamp it down in the black. This one will be the one that you see in its entirety. I did stamp it multiple times. Then I'm going to create a mask for it. I prefer Eclipse masking paper, but you can use whatever you have on hand or whatever your favorite one is. And then I'm going to stamp it again. It does not need to be a perfect impression on your masking paper. All you need for sure are the edges. The inside does not matter because we're not going to be using that. We're just going to be cutting along the outside edge to create our mask. And once we've trimmed out our mask, we can then put that in place. And then I chose to stamp another dahlia below it and above it. So that is how I'm going to fill out the rest of the card. Please excuse my dogs who are barking at, who knows, y'all. I mean, honestly, it could be absolutely anything that they are barking at. It could be a squirrel down the block. It could be somebody walking in my front door. Do we know? No, we do not. It's always a mystery to me, honestly. So anyway, with that mask in place, I'm going to stamp this one down and then the other one, and then you will remove the mask, and that first one we stamped will be complete and the other ones will be tucked behind. This is the one that we did with the ink smushing just right onto the desktop. And for this one, I am using that large, is it 1 in a million? I think it's called 1 in a million. I think. I've Copic colored this one before. And it's really beautiful for a slimline card, but I chose to stamp it at a diagonal so that I could get as much of that beautiful watercolor. This one does have a coordinating die, so I will be using that as well. For these two, we're going to be doing not this one. I'm sorry, not the one on the right. We're going to be doing similar techniques, but for the dahlias and the hydrangea, we're going to be shading with grays. Now, that sounds not very impressive, I know, but because we have like these kind of rainbow color background going on, shading with the grays, I chose cool grays because I have a lot of pinks, purples, blues that are over top of my flowers. If you chose to do warmer colors like reds, yellows, oranges, maybe opt for a warmer gray. That might look nicer. But basically, I'm just going to go in and I'm going to shade the flowers with my gray markers. I am not completely covering up the color. I don't want to make my flowers gray. I just want to give them a little bit more dimension. And shading with grays is a great way to get that dimensional look without having to go through and find each individual color. Now, the one on the right, that 1 in a million one we stamped, we will do that technique with that one, and I'll show you the way that I choose to shade those. But for these two, and you can already see even just with the 2 colors down, that it's really kind of bringing these florals to life. And you don't have to add near as much shading as I am. You could get away with just adding a little bit of shading, but we just want to differentiate it from the background and have these florals like up front in the, they're the focal point. They're the what you want your recipient to be looking at is these beautiful flowers. So I blended with a C7, C5, C3, and then C1. And again, not completely covering up the colors. I still want those to be seen. Now, the other side of this is instead of shading your actual flowers like we did here, you can create a shadow, which is what we're going to do with the hydrangea. Or I'm sorry, with the chrysanthemum. Whichever way you choose, it doesn't matter. I tend to make my shadows down and to the left because that's the way I learned it in art class in high school a million years, that was in actually middle school a million years ago. So that's how I do mine, but you just want to make sure you're consistent with whichever way you're doing it. So pick the one that's comfortable with you and roll with it. So I'm starting with my darkest color and I'm going to go right up against my flower. There's not going to be a gap between them. We're going to go right up against that black line and put down our darkest shadows. Already you can see how this brings the flower forward. And then from here, from the C7, I'm going to go to the C5, and we're eventually going to be blending all the way out to that C1 so that it is a nice soft blend and we don't have those super harsh lines for the shadow. But you could do this with any color. I mean, if you had if you're like, Kelly, I can't get the grasp of the shadows, try just outlining it in a darker color and then, have that color get a little bit softer into the background. Just try that because it will help make that separation between your background and your flower and help to bring it forward. Now, you absolutely could leave this exactly this way. And you'll see the one on the left is shading grays in the flower. The one on the right is shading behind it. This one, we are doing the shading inside, but we're not using grays. We're just picking one color that matches the background. This one is a little bit more interesting with the colors because you do need to pick colors that will blend together. So for the purple, I used a VO4, I think, and then I blended that into a pink RVO4. I blended that into a YO8. I know that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but yellows are different. And then I blended the YO8 into a YGO3. I blended my YGO3 into a BO2 where it was blue, but then a BG45. I'm sorry, B24 is what I use. So the 4 and the 5. You're looking at that last number. So you can also combine these. So I'm going to go back to this chrysanthemum and we've used the cool grays to add the shadow, but then I'm going to pick just one color. Like the one we just did, we used a lot of different colors to do the shading and help kind of bring it forward. This one, you can pick any of the colors that are in your flower. So remember when we were doing the watercolor, I used picked raspberry, I used carved pumpkin, and I used mustard seed. So you could shade the flower with a pink, an orange, or a yellow, and all of them would look nice. I chose pink just because I like it. Just because I like it better than the other two colors, honestly. But this is the same thing. We're not, even though we're blending with 4 colors, we're not completely covering up the watercolor. Copics are transparent. Watercolors are transparent. Now, the oxides are less transparent because of the pigment properties, but you get the idea. Like you're going over top of them. You're still going to be able to see those yellows and those oranges that are behind. We don't want to completely cover that up. And I'm also leaving whole parts that are just watercolor. I'm only adding shading to the actual floral part. I'm not adding any to the leaves because I don't want that to be my focal point. Now that we've taken a break for me to scold my dogs, because even I couldn't take it anymore, my apologies once again, we're going to move on to this bleaching technique. I've used this before, it's been a long time, and if it's something you're interested in, I could certainly do a more in-depth video on it. But basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with clean water, I'm going to go over the actual buds, of the flowers, and I am going to then blot it up with a clean cloth. So in order to do, like, we're doing this to remove the color because, you know, daffodils are mostly white or, you know, yellow. I want to be able to put yellow ink over top of them and not have my blue and yellow make green. Same thing with my orange. I don't want my blue and my orange to make brown. So I'm going to go in and remove the color. Something to note, you just want to make sure you're using a clean portion of your paper towel or cloth so that you're not redepositing your color. You do have to go over these a couple of times in order to remove that. This also works with Distress ink, not just oxides. So you can do this with either or. Once I've gone through and removed as much color as I want, now I can go back in with the watercoloring. I'm using the mustard seed. The only thing is with this one is you can't leave any open areas. If you leave any open areas on your daffodils, like up at the top, you're going to see the blue through it. And that might be the look that you want, which is cool. I'm here for artistic license. But if you want them to read as a solid yellow, then you're going to have to paint the whole thing. So once I have my yellow down, I'm going to start adding in some carved pumpkin, and then just on the centers to make them a bit more orange, I am going to add in crackling campfire. So doing basically just the same thing over and over again, and just filling these in. Now you could also, if you didn't want to watercolor, you could go in over top of these with Copic markers like we've been doing, or you could use colored pencils. Colored pencils are opaque, so you wouldn't probably have to do the bleaching technique, but it is something that's kind of cool. Maybe I will go back and do that one again, just something a little bit fun. But here you can see that chalkiness. Look at the centers of the daffodils. That's why I stamped all of my black after I did my watercoloring, because I didn't want that chalkiness. So now that all the you know, the different techniques are done, I am going to kind of rush through this last part. I'm doing all my die cutting. I left this part in because this card right here, this background, is actually going to make me 2 cards. And it's because I'm die cutting the mom right through the center. This one, I will show you how I did the gemstones. This is the Sands of Time gemstones from Picket Fence. They're very neutral colored. So this is the ones that I used for all of the cards. I like to use my crystal katana. I pick up, it's got a variety of different sizes in it. So this particular one is that one that we did at the angle, and then we added just a little bit of shading with one Copic marker. I die cut it, adhered it at an angle with some foam tape to make it, you know, just a little bit more interesting. And then the sentiment is from the Gerber Daisy set, and it says, "You're an amazing mom." That set also has like sister and I think grandma in it too, but these were for the NICU mommies. This one I'm going to show you. So I have some blue cardstock in the background. I have another piece that I've cut the word mom out of again. And so we're going to do some inlay, die cutting inlay. And so this one, you want to make sure that you keep the center of the O, because you'll need it to finish the rest of like the picture, the quote unquote picture. So this just went down flat. And then I'm putting my, the blue, same blue, letters in, and that way it's flush. And when I put on the best, so that die says like the best mom, it also has a dad in there. So Father's Day is coming up. If you're interested in that die, it's got both of them, but just make sure you're putting your center back in the same orientation to complete your picture. This one is a twofer. This technique gives us a 2-for-1. So now I have that same blue that I cut the mom out of for the last card. This will now become the background for this card. And I will use the mom letters that we cut out of the hydrangea to fill in this one, and it'll be the same thing where we put the best. So the sentiment will be the same, but the cards will have 2 different looks. This is really great if you have like your own mom and your mother-in-law, or, you know, maybe you have 2 daughters, or your mom and your daughter. Like, you can get a 2-for-1 if you're up against it to get a Mother's Day card. So now we're just going to briefly go over them since I couldn't show you all of the putting together. There's this one you just saw. This is just down flat and it's inlaid. This is its companion, its partner. So those ones, you know, one created the other kind of thing. This one, I trimmed down the daffodils, matted it on some black for some contrast. This one, I actually put the letters down and then I took a white gel pen and did a shadow to help that black, the best mom, kind of pop off of it. This one I just matted on black. I didn't do anything else to it, just added the Thinking of You sentiment and some gems. That sentiment is crooked. Don't worry, I fixed it before I gave it away. And then these ones, this is actually from the one watercolor that we did. I cut them in half, matted them on purple, stamped the sentiments in purple, and then this one I added a frame and then the lattice. This is the first one you saw me put together, and then that is all of the cards with all of the techniques. So I hope if you are a Distress Oxide fan, this is super helpful to you, to give you some ideas to use them for watercolor. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I always appreciate your time, and I will catch you on the next video. Bye.